This is a photograph taken just inside the double electric fence that surrounds Millhaven Maximum Security Institution outside of Kingston, Ontario. That's me. It was taken in November 2006. I was the assistant warden of correctional programs there and also completing my MBA. Canadian Business Magazine was doing a piece on the variety of students attracted to MBAs, and my school, Queen's, asked me if I would be interviewed, so I said okay. The thing I have to say is that a photograph of me beside the words top marks is totally misleading. That in no way reflects my academic performance of my MBA. Of course, the editor or the writer selected that title for the entire article, and in fact, I tried to Photoshop it out, but it turned into a mess. The reason that image is important for me to start with is because Millhaven is the place where this story begins, and Millhaven is the place where my journey with questions begins. So I take you back to April of 1996. It is my very first day of teaching anger and emotions management at Millhaven. To get into my classroom, you need to go through those double fences that were on the first picture, through 3 or 4 big electric barriers, past several checkpoints, down this hallway, through a door just like this. This is actually a cell door. I couldn't find a picture of our actual classroom steel door, but they're very, very similar. Down another little hallway and into the classroom at the back. Every offender that comes down that main hallway is up against the wall and, individually frisked before they're allowed into my class. So here they are, 10 men sitting in front of me, federally incarcerated for violent crimes, forcible confinement, assault causing bodily harm, aggravated assault, first and second degree murder. The majority of the 2-hour class goes well. So well, in fact, that we finished 20 minutes early, and I'm actually quite thrilled with their apparent cooperation. And I do think, we will hit all the objectives that have been so conscientiously laid out by national headquarters in my little manual. It's when I open the classroom door, which is behind that steel door, 20 minutes early, that all hell breaks loose. From controlled to uncontrolled in a matter of seconds. The inmates leap up from their chairs, all 10 of them, rush out the classroom door, punching holes in the drywall on their way out. They charge down the little hallway to that steel door, which is locked. I later learned that steel door is only opened at very specific moments to permit really controlled movement down this main thoroughfare. They begin pounding, kicking, screaming, punching more holes in the drywall, yelling things that I know I'm not allowed to yell on video. And it's a complete shock. I'm standing back at the classroom door, totally stunned. I have never been this close to so much aggression and violence. It's not farther away than from here to the wall. My heart is pounding, I don't know what to do, and I'm increasingly aware of my very vulnerable position. Between me and that locked steel door, which is the only exit, is a group of 10 extremely violent, extremely dangerous, aggressive men. I have my hand poised over my personal alarm, because of course we have one, but I'm extremely ambivalent about pressing it, and I'll tell you why. On the one hand, if I press it, it summons an immediate and considerable response from 6 officers who will believe that I am in absolute imminent danger, and they will subdue the offenders accordingly. Big consequences. On the other hand, maybe I am in imminent danger, and I start to think about my colleagues who have either been taken hostage or who have found themselves just like this on the wrong side of a riot. So I have to do something. The inmates' behavior is escalating, and I notice now that they're starting to look and point backwards at me to my hand that's poised over my alarm. So I take a deep breath, and I ask a question. Actually, I yelled a question. "Gentlemen!" And they stopped, and I couldn't believe they stopped. Do you know what normal people do when they have 20 minutes to wait? Silence. And I thought to myself, this will either go really well or very badly. They chat, and that is what we're going to do. So I took my hand off my alarm and walked very slowly toward the offenders and asked them about movies they had watched, music they like, food that they missed. In other words, we chatted for the whole remaining, 17 minutes. As I wrote up my notes that night at the end of my first day, I asked myself, what made that question, do you know what normal people do? What made it so powerful for the inmates? And that sort of started my 20-year conversation with myself about questions. I asked a lot of questions. I asked a lot in the 13 years I worked with inmates and for the Correctional Service of Canada, and I ask a lot of my business clients now, senior leaders and their teams who work in some of the world's most prestigious companies. And I learned from and noticed the questions that have an impact. Which ones create a pause or disrupt a pattern? And here's what I've noticed. When we over-identify with our role, inmate, guard, student, mother, president, CEO, we develop a very rigid view of who we are. And I've noticed that the more extreme the environment, the more rigid that view becomes. So there seems to be something about living on the edge, that sort of relentless pressure, the exhaustion, the adrenaline, that creates a kind of identity rigor mortis. Second thing I know and have learned is that it's extremely difficult to change or even control our behavior if we have a very rigid view of ourselves. The inmates, it didn't occur to the inmates that normal people behavior was possible for them. I was in Washington, D.C. in last November working with high-level people from the Department of National Defense. It didn't occur to them that coaching behavior could be part of their repertoire. They see themselves as military leaders. Sometimes it doesn't occur to mothers that self-care behavior, completely apart from the needs of others, can be available to them. A good question to ask yourself is, how does your sense of identity restrict your options? The third thing I've learned is that one of the most powerful sets of questions are those that point to the parts of ourselves that we've neglected or abandoned in order to fulfill our own or others' definitions of our roles. Those are the questions that often make contact. Contact is that moment of insight. It's that, in the vernacular, we call it the aha moment. But it's really, clients describe that moment, and we know what it feels like, a moment of relief, sometimes a moment of recognition. Sometimes we laugh at that moment of contact. All of a sudden, the possibility for change is there. It leads to a kind of behavioral or psychological freedom. One of the first things I listen for when I'm listening to leaders in my work is I listen for their rigid patterns of behavior. What is their version of banging on the door when they have 20 minutes to spare? What is their patterned response to stress, to power, to failure, to success? We all have these patterns. Understanding those rigid responses provides us with clues about how the person sees themselves. And understanding how they see themselves provide us with clues about the parts of themselves they may have left behind. And that's important because at the highest levels of leadership, it's rarely about competence. At least that's not why I'm called in. It's about expansion. A few weeks ago, my colleagues and I were speaking with a CEO from the UK, and when we were talking about the coaching engagement, he said, I just want to be a better version of myself. And those are the perfect words he used, because when it comes to expansion, it's not about being different than who we are, it's about being more of who we are. Human behavior is complex, it's context-specific, and it's highly influenced by the story we tell ourselves about ourselves. And so when I see rigid patterns of behavior, it suggests to me that someone is cutting themselves off unnecessarily from options. Why would you settle for this when you can have this? I often work with senior leaders who are moving from one level of leadership to another. So senior VPs who are becoming SVPs, or SVPs who are moving into the executive VPs who are moving into the C-suite. And they're a really interesting bunch because they usually come with a slew of very sophisticated patterns that have worked tremendously well for them. And part of our relationship is about examining, assessing, and then most of the time unlearning and relearning those patterns. When people first begin the engagement, they're all for it, they love it, they think they want it, but that's because they're in that blissful ignorance that Peter mentioned this morning. They don't know what they're in for. About 3 months into it, they actually hate it, and they want to quit because it's really hard work. And then about another month into it, they start to love it again. And they love it because they grow. They love it because they start to connect with new ways of thinking, which enable them to feel differently. They also start to recognize and remember parts of themselves that they forgot about, parts that they may have cut off in order to fulfill a role or an expectation. And those parts of themselves always have something to say and usually have a lot to offer. All you have to do is ask. Thank you.